Hi everyone, my name is Kent C. Dodds and I'm super excited to be joined by my friend Jen. Say hi, Jen.
Hi, everyone.
So
So
Jen and
I'm,
I,
oh,
oh sorry, I was just gonna say I'm trying to remember like whenever I do these, I like to remember when the first time was that we met. And I think we started interacting on Twitter because of the the apocalypse tweet. Oh my gosh, this is so great. So I think it was 2018 is when I made the Simply React talk, and as I was working on it, I wanted to find the open source component that had the most number of props. And so I just tweeted about it, and Jen, it was so perfect. Jen replied with, "I call that an apocalypse." Oh my gosh, that was so great, and I used it in my talk. I just loved it. So that's as far back as we go, and then we met in person the first time at a conference, or maybe
React Conf,
yeah, React Conf. Yeah,
I think. Wait, no, maybe one before React
it may have
Conf.
been React Rally. I can't remember now. And
Oh,
I
Atlanta?
came. No, well, that may have been it. I remember I came out to New York, I think in 2019, to do something.
Our
And
paths have crossed just
yeah, we've
multiple
done a couple of
times
things.
in
Yeah, it's
various ways.
fun.
Yeah.
So
I
anyway,
still get people that like that tweet, by the way, the apocalypse, and I know it comes from you using it in your talk.
yeah, it was so good. Just classic. So yeah, Jen, why don't so I've gotten to know you the last few years and enjoyed following you and everything. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody else who hasn't had the pleasure yet?
Sure. So I'm Jen. Hi. Last name is Creighton, and you can find me on Twitter at girlcode, and girl is spelled with a U if you want to follow me there. I am a senior staff engineer working on open source at Apollo, and specifically, I work on the Apollo client.
Awesome. Apollo is definitely a name that most people watching probably has heard before. Really popular tool, and yeah, I think that's awesome. So thank you for your work on it. So you kind of started the beginning of the year with them, right? So it's been
Yeah,
9 months
it's
now.
been it's about 6 months actually. So I started in March. I took a little bit of a break.
Oh, right. Okay. Six
Yeah.
months. Yeah. In March of 2020. None of us remembers that.
It was a good time to switch jobs. Wasn't it? Was a bad time. It
Yeah.
was very scary.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm glad that the things have been going okay. And I'd love to get to know what your experience was like transitioning. So before you were working on a product, what was that?
So I've been working on, products my entire time in tech so far. So that was about like 7.5 years of just like straight up product work. And sometimes with B2B companies and sometimes with consumer products. So the last two places that I worked was ClassPass and then The Wing. And those were both products. They were used a little bit differently. One was a pretty free-ranging consumer app that pretty much anyone could sign up to work out, book time at gyms, or book a fitness class somewhere.
Hmm.
But then the second one was actually members based. So if you were a member of the Wing, which was a co-working space, then you would use that app. So still products for consumers, but just a little bit different. And then I transitioned into open source full time. I was already doing some community open source work beforehand, but now it's my full time day job.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like, I think anybody who's done much work in open source has some feelings associated with it. Mostly for me, it's mostly positive, but there are definitely some like struggles with open source. And I'm curious what it's like to transition from doing some open source on the side, or maybe as part of your job a little bit, to being like full-time open source. What was that transition like? And yeah, well, like I'd love to hear both the positives and negatives of doing open source full-time.
For me, it's been like such a relief not to work on products anymore, just because I'd been doing it for a really long time. And there's definitely interesting problems to be solved in product engineering, but I was kind of done with it. And I was like, if I build another like button component system, I'm just gonna like lose,
Yeah.
like everything in my brain will just fall out. I can't like build like another thing like this, or like, and To be honest, I was always really interested in open source projects. And so I actually, like, I spent a lot of time late at night crawling through code in repos, trying to understand how things worked, or checking out GitHub issues, pull requests, reading comments, especially in the React repo, because I was using React at, you know, the majority of these jobs I've been working with React like 4 or 5 years now. And I was just really curious about what the open source side of that looked like. How did things work? What could I glean about what the team, like how they work together? And then sort of doing some work in open source. I contributed to some projects, and then a lot of my work has been more in like community stuff, like, you know, talks about React and things like that, or community events. Then transitioning into actually doing the work on the open source side, it is so very different. It is so different, and in some good ways and in some bad ways, but mostly in very good ways for me, ways that I feel very comfortable in. That whole thing where I'm like reading repos at night, like that is my day job now. Like I just do that during the day and get paid to like understand how things work and check out new architectural decisions and try and figure out why we do things a certain way. And that is like, oh my God, that is my catnip.
Well, that's
Really,
awesome.
it's the thing I love most. So
Yeah,
that's been great.
that's tons of fun to be able to have for your day job, the thing that you're doing on the side before, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, very cool. So is your day to day, I'm coming from my perspective as an open source maintainer. I spend more time in GitHub, like on github.com, than I do in my editor. Is that like similar to your experience? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, I am absolutely on github.com constantly throughout the day. And it's because that's where all the knowledge is. So if you need any bit of knowledge, it's not just, I think a lot of people think that open source maintaining is just writing some code, spinning up a pull request, looking at a contribution, maybe deciding to merge it in, looking at an issue, going to your editor to figure it out. But a lot of it is this historical, like digging through things, especially when you weren't always the maintainer of the project. You're coming in either new or with a new group of people, or it's got a varied history like the Apollo client does. It's been around for a while. It's gone through iterations. AC3 just launched, which my coworker Ben, he's the architect of all of this, put in a ton of work behind. And so a lot of my job now is actually going through various pull requests and issues from Ben, trying to figure out the history of things so that I can answer someone's question about why something might not be working, or know if an issue needs to be looked at or not. That's just where I spend most of my time. I'm very rarely actually in my editor writing code. I'm more doing this like archaeological digging, looking for clues, sort of Sherlock Holmes thing.
Yeah. Are you pretty happy with that arrangement, or would you like to spend a little bit more time coding?
I'm actually really happy with this arrangement. I actually have a project that's specific that I'm leading, which is to do a rewrite of the Apollo client dev tools. And when I actually do write code, it's for that project. And that one's a little bit more like a product in the sense of like the traditional sense back what I used to do. And then the rest of it is like this archaeological digging of Apollo client, answering questions, figuring out how things work. And I'm only 6 months in. So actually in open source, there's not a lot of time to like get really spun up on an entire library with an entire history, an entire
Hmm.
set of like why things were done or why
Yeah.
they need to change. Um, so right now I really like the measure of work that I have.
Yeah, that I especially like 6 months on a project the size of Apollo client like that. And it's not just the Apollo client that you have to understand, but also all of the pieces that it interacts with as well. And like the entire, idea of GraphQL and I don't know if you were using GraphQL before, but that's a pretty big thing too.
Yeah, I actually wasn't. And so a lot of my learning over the past 6 months has also been GraphQL based.
Yeah.
I have always wanted to use it as at a job, and then um, it can be very difficult to convince a company to go that way. You know, there's
Yeah.
overhead involved. But there were like 2 or 3 companies I worked at that really wanted to use GraphQL, and then just the consensus of getting all the engineers on board with this change, where it just kind of fell flat at some point.
That is too
Did
bad.
you used it at PayPal, didn't you?
Yeah, so I never used it myself, but PayPal absolutely uses it, and I worked with teams that used it. I built one app that used GraphQL, and we only had a couple of areas where we actually used GraphQL, just like 2 or 3 mutations, a couple queries. So it was I just really couldn't justify adding Apollo for something like that. So we used GraphQL request
Yeah,
for that, and it was great. And yeah, GraphQL is pretty cool.
it
So
is.
got some pretty interesting aspects to it. And PayPal, when I left, they were working on some really cool things where we'd have just a single GraphQL endpoint for all of PayPal's APIs, which are many. And it's really cool that GraphQL makes something like that. I wouldn't say trivial, because it's not trivial, but relatively trivial. Like if we wanted to do the same thing with REST like type of interface, that would be very non-trivial. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's cool that you're able to contribute to the GraphQL community through Apollo client, which is used by like a silly amount of people.
Yeah, we were talking before this call started, but I've usually been just in the React JavaScript ecosphere. And so kind of moving myself a little bit more towards GraphQL, state management libraries in general, still sticking with React because of course Apollo client is, primarily used with React applications. So I've moved a little bit, but I'm still pretty close to React. I'll
Yeah,
never fully leave the React community. I love it too much.
it is a special place. I like being here, and I
Yeah.
like that you're here too. Um, so what's it like to maintain a project that's used by so many people? And like, what's your experience been as an open source maintainer?
Um, so far, I mean, my initial thoughts being only 6 months in is I'm terrified all the time, but it's a lot of pressure. Uh, because when you were building a product, yeah, like a lot of people were going to eventually see your decisions, but it was actually pretty easy to like, if you made a mistake, it somehow made it to prod. Usually there were steps between that would catch it, and it went out. It didn't break other people's work. And it's very
Yeah.
different in open source. Like you could break people's work. So in that way, it's kind of like very terrifying. In another respect, though, people have like a great love and affinity for Apollo and Apollo client in particular. And it feels really good to work on a project that people already have like a sense of love for, that they find like lovely to work with. And especially with a lot of the changes that Ben made for AC3, it's even nicer to work with. I've been building applications with it, just, for fun, and I really like it. So, two sides. One, terrifying, could break everything. But on the other hand, like this is a well-loved open source project. Lots of people who want to be like involved, lots of people with questions, which can get a little tiring, but is also like very motivating to
Sure.
do like your best work to figure out, how best to serve someone. And I really enjoy serving developers. So it's really nice to be able to build something for developers. It feels really nice to know you're helping like people in a different way. The same kind of way I used to do with talks, where I was like, clearly my audience is I'm trying to help developers. I get that same sort of gratification out of working on Apollo client.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I've been doing open source on the side and sort of like, so when I worked on open source at PayPal, it was like PayPal projects that we were using. And so PayPal was sort of financing my open source. I was
Mm-hmm.
working on open source during the day often. And now I do open source during the day, but now because I work for myself, I'm financing my open source. So that's kind of been interesting. But Anyway, so I haven't technically been full-time open source before, but I do or I can relate to the joy and satisfaction there is in knowing that you're enabling other people to make the world a better place, however they do that,
Yeah.
with the technology that you make.
Or just to do good work. Like we all like doing good work, and it just is easier when your tools are good.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Well, so if I were um, like coming into a new project as a maintainer, or maybe wanted to become a maintainer of a big project, what are some of the things that you'd tell me to look out for, like some pitfalls, or maybe some things that I can do to better prepare to be an open source maintainer and be successful?
My first question when I was interviewing to join Apollo was, tell me about how you manage your work-life balance on open source. Because that is the first thing that is going to get you is complete and utter burnout. Open
Mm,
source doesn't have any 9 to 5 hours like you would on a regular job where you're just going in and people are only online for a certain time. In the open source world, it spans the entire globe, and so you're getting questions in at times that you're asleep, or maybe you're not asleep, like some people on the React team who I know are answering Twitter questions when I'm like, it is 4 a.m. in London, what are you doing?
for real.
It's a really serious problem though, open source burnout. And so if you really want to work in open source either as a full-time job, or you are really passionate about a library and you want to start to become a maintainer, the first thing you have to look out for is actually yourself, making sure that you're okay and that you're still giving as much as you can to your job and your friends and your family. And these are all the other things in your life that are going to make open source possible. But if you don't have that backbone, if you ignore it, you're not going to be able to do anything in open source. And then some of my other advice for people who just generally want to get into open source, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to, contribute to a project. And I think there's also a lot of misunderstandings about what the collaborative aspect in open source is going to look like. And so if you're expecting people to be immediately available all the time, immediately be able to answer your questions, immediately be able to provide feedback, that's not how open source unfortunately works. Usually in open source, you're dealing with really small maintainer teams that, like you said, are often not doing this as their full-time job. Even at Apollo, the Apollo client team is 3 people. That's it.
Wow.
And like that's a big project. It doesn't just span Apollo client, it spans all the tools that go into that, including like all of our libraries that have to do with React or the DevTools extension. There's a lot of work. We can never take on as much as we want to. And so we also can't answer questions, can't provide feedback like in a super timely manner. So patience is the second thing that like is absolutely required if you want to like contribute to open source. And also I would say the third thing is like kind of goes along with the work-life balance, but is about keeping yourself like on track. Because all your work is usually in GitHub, you can lose track of issues that you need to look at, or PRs, or other things that you are doing. So you have to find some sort of management tool for that.
Yeah, what have you found? So I've got a couple of questions actually, and these two are kind of related. So I'm curious what you found to be an effective management strategy for you, and I'll tell you mine first, and then I want to hear what yours is. So pretty much, I go 100% on email notifications. So it gets into my inbox, and if I'm done with it, then I archive it, and if I need to deal with it, it just stays in my inbox. And then I'm like an inbox zero kind of person. So if it's in there, then
Okay.
it's going to get dealt with eventually. But one drawback to this, and I'm curious if this is kind of your experience too, is like you said, open source, like people are constantly using and asking questions overnight while you're sleeping. And so when I wake up, it's very common for me to wake up to like 15, maybe 30 sometimes more
Oh
emails
God.
from GitHub on my various projects. I have over 100 modules on NPM, so like not all of them are very active. Most of these are actually testing library, but like I wake up with just a silly amount of notifications. Some of them can be dealt with in just a second, but like those seconds add up. So yeah, and then like because I'm such an inbox zero kind of person, it actually, I think it gives me a little bit of anxiety having those messages in my inbox. So anyway, I'm curious what your strategy for dealing with that, because I imagine that Apollo probably gets a fair amount more notifications because of the size and the number of people who are trying to use it. So yeah, what are your strategies for that?
We do get a lot of notifications, um, but I think actually everyone on the team probably has a different way of doing it. And I need to like actually ask them this question
Hmm.
on Monday or no, Tuesday because of the holiday when
Woo!
we're all in the office again. And I'll maybe collect like their answers because this is a really good question of like how you manage this. I'm still working on my system. I am by no means got something down because I'm only 6 months in. This is going to take some iteration. Right now, I'm using a bit of, we use assigning on the issues that need to be looked at. And so I keep a tab open with my assigned tasks there. I also copy all of them into Notion in a task queue for myself so that I look at that pretty much every day and see, well, what was I doing last? Okay, what do I need to do? And then I prioritize my queue and then move things into done when they're actually merged if it has to do with that or the task is actually done, depending on what I'm doing. And then I take like copious notes during meetings and stuff because it helps to remind me about things. Not really because I'm going to go look back at my notes. There's just something about me writing something physically down that helps my brain. And so occasionally when I have something that I'm like, we need to remember to do something later, but I don't really think it belongs in the task queue. I kind of want to keep it in mind. I will literally just write it down really quickly, and it somehow like that like I don't know motion for some reason like locks it into my brain a little bit better.
Oh,
So that's
that.
kind of what I'm trying out.
Yeah, that's good. And it sounds like something that I kind of considered as you were talking about that like another approach for me that would solve my like flood of email is to maybe go with that sort of mentality of, okay, just every day I can have like my open source block of time, and then I go and look at all of those issues that were opened between the last time I looked and now, and then and deal with them at that time rather than waking up in the morning and like grabbing my phone, lying in bed, like trying to do open source on my phone, which actually happens a lot. I probably have released as I have automated releases, and I think I've probably released as many versions of my packages from my phone as I have from my desktop, which is probably not a good thing. It's cool that I can, but I don't think I should do that. So maybe I'll change things up a little bit, be a little less.
Yeah, you're like on the go with these things. You're like, okay, new version out for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
but having a Notion set up, it
mhm,
sounds like you're very organized, which I think you would need to be.
I have to be. I have ADD. I have a coping strategy, which is lists, more lists, 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 lists. Write everything down, create tasks, put things in a calendar. Yeah. And my other like big thing that I do is that I use Slackbot a lot to remind me of things. I love my Slackbot. He's my little friend. I'm like, hey, remind me to do this thing. And it kind of just frees up some capacity in my brain to do something else. And
Yeah.
yeah, I can just safely rely that on any of my devices, he's going to be able to like notify me, hey, remember you need to do X. And I'm like, cool, thank you.
Yeah. I kind of use Todoist, like a combination of Todoist and my email inbox, like snooze stuff to do that. Because yeah, I agree, and the calendar too, right? Like
Yeah.
as much stuff as I can get into this machine and out of my brain as possible. Yeah,
Yeah. And then when you need to actually take vacation, you just shut off all devices
it's brilliant.
and then you're done for a bit, you know?
Yeah, that's great. Well, Jen, as we are kind of coming down on our time, what else about open source do you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I think one of the things that has surprised me, so I asked this question on Twitter and I said, if you've wanted to contribute to open source, what has stopped you from doing so? And a lot of the answers were things that we hear pretty often, which is, I don't know where to start. I'm not sure how the process works. I don't know which projects to choose. But then there was another one that I found really surprising, and that was people like berating themselves for not like contributing to open source yet, and saying it as if like, I know I have to do it at some point. It was kind of a weird mentality. And so, as much as I love open source and I really want people to contribute and get involved, it's got a lot of benefits to it. You can level yourself up, you can get things to put on your resume. It is just a really great tool. No one should feel like they have to do it. Like,
Yeah.
if you do not have time, if this isn't your style of working, it's cool. You can just do what I do and just read some open source every once in a while, or just don't. It's totally fine. I'm really not sure where this, like, I have to do it came from, but I want people to know also it's cool. You don't have to.
Yeah, I like that perspective. One thing that I use as kind of a way to combat burnout for myself is I kind of made a rule that if it's not my problem, then I don't care. That's it's not exactly how I feel about it, but that's sort of how I deal with it. And so like I only really work on stuff that is impacting me directly, or I'm just interested in working on it, for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And that
And
that
it
way
can
you feel less pressure, I think.
it can also like take a long time to find like a project that you're that passionate about, and like just no one needs to put that amount of pressure on themselves to do this sort of work. It kind of like at some point will maybe come naturally if you find a project that you're just really interested in, and maybe it won't. It's all good.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a great way to wrap up, or a good thought to wrap up on. So you already mentioned we can reach out and follow you on Twitter, Girl Code with a U. I like that. And yeah, is there any other like last tips or like a challenge you want to give to folks who are watching to help them stretch themselves a little bit?
I mean, I just said like you don't have to do open source, and I totally mean that. But if you're super interested in it, I think playing around with GitHub and understanding how you can comb through like issues and pull requests is actually going to help you in your day-to-day job as well. Because often you join a company where there actually is a lot of history, and being able to figure out like how those things work and how you can like search for things and find answers, especially in commit messages and such, it's going to help you a lot. And it's also like a lot of fun. You find some funny things in the repos, so I think trying that out is like a great like first step to like wade into the waters.
Yeah, I think that's a good tip. And it's always fun to look at these big projects and see the early commit messages
Yeah.
before they got all like formalized and stuff.
Yeah,
'Cause-
and some projects like they just have really great explanations of like what they're doing and why, and it sort of like amps up your like engineering knowledge, so it's fun.
yeah, that's great. Well, Jen, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure, and hope everybody gives open source a try if that's what they want to get into. I think it's fun. It's helped me be a better developer for sure. And yeah, I wish you the best with everything that you're doing with Apollo Client. Thank you for your work. And yeah, we'll see everybody later.
Thanks, Kent.
Bye, everyone.